Okay. Yeah, I'll open us up with some prayer and then we'll get started.
All right.
Dear Father, thank you for this day and everything that you've provided for us. Pray that this series that we're doing will be well, that it'll be informative, and that it'll just, be able to provide some good dialogue around, what historical knowledge we can have relating to the Bible and the Gospels and the New Testament. Pray that everyone has a good week. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're starting a new series on the... It just started. On the historicity of the New Testament. So this is really trying to answer the question of, is the New Testament historically reliable? Can we trust it as having real, factual, true knowledge? And this week we're going over what is historical investigation and all that entails. So here's our series topics as we're going to go through. I'm pretty sure we have class next week, even though it's New Year's, and then
it's not New Year's.
Not New Year's, Thanksgiving. Even though it's Thanksgiving, and then the end of December we'll miss a couple weeks because of Christmas and New Year's. So that's like our winter break, I guess. And got a bunch of sources. Rely on Cold Case Christianity a lot, written by J. Warner Wallace. It's about a cold case detective, someone who looked at murder and homicide investigations, but years, if not decades, after when they actually occurred. Things where an active investigation has stopped and they couldn't find the culprit. So seeing what sort of information we can understand from him. Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels by Lydia McGrew. She is actually a well-known writer in this sphere as well. And then Miracles by C.S. Lewis.
Some of my favorites.
Yeah, no. C.S. Lewis, just all of his stuff is amazing. So so historical investigation is a process designed to determine whether a historical document or account is accurate and trustworthy. And this is important because it tells us, it's really trying to come up with a sort of science that isn't science on how we can determine when things in the past occur, and we don't have anyone who's living who can testify to something. We're instead looking at things that are kind of fixed in place and time. So it's really kind of like a crime scene investigation. You have to look into the details and understand that you can't change anything that's been going on. The best you can do is preserve and understand what actually, what the results were, I guess you could say, and then look at those results and try to infer what actually happened and what actually occurred. So if, for example, in a hypothetical crime scene, you find a dead body with a knife in the back, you can go, well, hey, maybe they died because of the stab wound in their back, that type of thing. But you don't actually see them die from the knife wound in their back. You have to simply infer that. And so, there's a whole bunch of things that you can do as part of this, right? You can go out and try to gather evidence, try to understand what maybe physically was around, who was around, why things were happening. And nowadays, you could interview witnesses and whatever else, but for cold cases, you don't necessarily have that privilege. A lot of times, your witnesses have passed away or they're no longer around. You're unable to find them. Additionally, you have to come up with possible different explanations and pit them against each other to see which one holds up the best. And once again, historical investigation is not science. Science is specifically a process where you make observations and experiments, where you're able to experiment with things and then come to conclusions based on that. Historical investigation, you have no way to experiment. Mm-hmm. You may use aspects of science as part of your investigation, so tools that have been produced by science, For example, in archaeology, they'll take laser scans of the whole of the place to get digital means, so then you can communicate that worldwide with people, and they can look and investigate. But the reality is, historical investigation is not able to experiment. When talking about, say, the resurrection, you're not able to kill Jesus Christ 100 times and see if he rises again every single time. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we're definitely setting up going into the historicity discussion. So unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately for some of you, we're going to talk about reasoning quite a bit today.
Yeah.
The way I like to think about this, I like to approach it more from like a scientific standpoint. I took a really great class in college called I think philosophy of science or something along those lines, that talks about what you can know versus what you can't know. And I think it's really good to apply that kind of thought process to the historicity question of Christ as resurrection. Mostly because the arguments you hear on the other side, from the atheist perspective, is either trying to like shift the burden of proof claim, which I'll get into a little bit, or their logical fallacies, typically, from what I see. And so I'm going to talk about that so that we don't really get hung up on some of those most basic arguments that they come back to us from. And we get into like the actual questions that we're asking. Because a lot of times, even as Christians, we don't ask the right questions. We kind of just maybe make a claim and want to move on.
Yeah, and the reasoning, logical reasoning, is one of the tools we use. One of the primary tools, I'd say, we use in weighing evidence and evaluating whether something can be trustworthy or not, and comparing things against each other.
Yeah, so for this slide, specifically, did you make AI or use AI?
I
like it.
Yeah, so all of them I used AI.
What one did you use?
Just the Bing one. Yeah.
Which one?
Bing AI.
Oh, the Bing. That's what we use at work.
Yeah, it's just
good.
really simple.
So I'll go through kind of what I want to talk about here, and feel free to jump in and talk about anything you want to talk about too. But the quick definition, abductive reasoning, that's going to be trying to explain a phenomenon with the most likely explanation. All right, so that's kind of the type of reasoning that we're going to be dealing with when we're talking about history.
So whereas like deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning try to come to a conclusion of the only, the right answer.
Yeah.
Abductive reasoning is less concerned about finding the right answer and more concerned about finding the most likely answer. And this kind of goes along with the idea of a crime scene investigation, of a cold case. In a, say like a crime scene investigation, they use abductive reasoning to help highlight the directions that they should continue investigating. And from there, they build up a sort of weight of evidence in favor or against that you can build arguments for, to try to come to the most complete picture of the puzzle, in which case then you compare and you see, hey, does this rise to the burden of proof?
Right. Yeah, and the way I like to think about that is 100% true. We're using abductive reasoning when we're talking about historicity. But I think that it's kind of like an umbrella term that includes both deductive and inductive reasoning on the inside. So I still like to talk about those two, which I'm going to talk about in just a quick second. But I think the easiest way to know about these types of reasoning, it's all really abstract, is just like examples. Talk about examples. I think it makes sense to everyone. And an example I found, just threw it in a ChatGPT, it gave me something like this. So it's like to say that Jesus did not rise from the dead, since miracles aren't possible, is poor abductive reasoning, because it actually doesn't answer the question that's being posited, right? So the question is did Jesus rise from the dead, not whether or not that's possible. So it's actually like a yes or no question, right? So again, that's actually a logical fallacy. It's called the red herring fallacy. It's answering a different question than was posited.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's like what the first point highlights is abductive reasoning is primarily about trying to figure out what is a reasonable explanation first, and then what is the most reasonable explanation compared to possible, right?
Yeah.
Because they see a lot of things that you go, well, if this is true and this is true, then it shouldn't be possible in crime scene investigations. And if you stop there, then you would be really poor at your job.
Yeah. It's a good way. I like that analogy, thinking about like a crime scene, because that's kind of what we're doing here.
I always think of Spock. Once you rule out the impossible, whatever remains.
However improbable must Yeah, be the truth.
Yeah.
Spock is a really good
Yeah, there you go. Spock sounds like a good Christian. All right, I'm going to get into a little bit into deductive versus inductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning is much more concrete than inductive reasoning. And I know a lot of you guys are all smart, you kind of know at least probably bits and pieces of this. It's much more limited in its application, but it's much more certain in its application as well than inductive reasoning. So again, good example here. It has to follow you're going to give two premises, and then you're going to have a conclusion from that premise. It must follow that sort of like, what's that called? You know, A plus B equals C type structure.
Sure.
You know? So the classic example that everybody gives when you ask about deductive reasoning is this. You have your two premises. So it's that Socrates, the philosopher, was a man, and that all men are mortal. And if those two things are true, the conclusion is that Socrates must be mortal, must be true, right? So the only assumptions that you have to take is that the first premises are true. And then if you can follow correctly from there.
It's very definitional.
It is definitional.
It's almost like all you have are your predicates, your assumptions, and then from there everything else just kind of falls into place.
Right, and the key about deduction is that when you use it, it will be 100% true as long as your assumptions are true. And that's why when we actually talk about theology is actually deductive reasoning, because we have certain assumptions, and there's actually only two in Christianity. It's that the God of the Bible exists, and he is who he says he is, right? Because if God existed but could lie, that causes a lot of problems. And that the Bible is 100% true. As long as you take those two assumptions, everything within theology becomes deductive. There actually is an answer to them. So, which is a good thing. That means we can come to truth itself. But we can contrast that with induction. And induction, I think the best way to explain it is just like science. You know, it's just testing things. It's watching observable things take place. The only thing about that is, as Kal, you pointed out here, I think, that's like proofs. And proofs are not knowledge. You actually can't prove anything from a like knowledge standpoint in science. It's not possible. I'll kind of get into that real quickly here. If I have like a pen like this, I think I've done this in the class, so maybe you guys will remember this. But if I take this and I drop it once, we all saw it fell, hit the ground, I take it and I drop it again. Then I took it here, and if I let go, what do you guys think is going to happen again? It's going to fall, right? But can you prove that that's what's going to happen if I drop it again, right? If you think about it from just a completely logical standpoint, can you say for certain that it's going to drop? The answer is actually no. You can't know that, right? Like, that's possible. There's, the what if gravity stopped working right now and it just floated in the air, right? So it's like, of course, that's not going to happen. But why is it not going to happen? It's because you guys are taking an assumption that you can't prove that things are uniform within the world, right? That the constant of gravity is going to stay constant. And there's no reason for you to believe that. It's 100% assumption, right? And as Christians...
The only reason you can come up with is that, well, it was that way in the past.
Yeah.
But the opposite is also true. There are a lot of things that were a particular way in the past that are no longer that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have no real reason to believe that way.
So, that main principle right there is uniformity. So it's going to, under the exact same circumstances here, right? I'm going to hold it at this point, I'm going to drop it at this point, and at this time and place. That is going to happen as an assumption. But as Christians, we shouldn't have any problem with that, because if the God of the universe exists and he wants us to learn about him through his creation, which it says in the Bible, that's a necessity that we have to hold to. The real problem comes for the atheists. It's like, well, why are things uniform? And they cannot answer that question. So as someone who likes philosophy, I love that. But if you actually bring that argument to any like Dawkins or some of these guys, I know Jordan Peterson was just talking to, I think Dawkins, and he brought that up, and Dawkins just didn't care about that, and it's like, well, that's a big deal, It's like, but that's the main assumption with induction.
It goes along with I believe what Francis Bacon says, said, where scientists make Einstein. Einstein said. Scientists make poor philosophers.
Oh yeah, that's funny. That's true. So that's the main assumption I think that you gotta hold with induction. But there's actually two other ones. So there's causal relationships. It's like, well, if gravity applies to this clip here, it's also going to apply to the pen, you know, you kind of have to do that.
Yeah, you need to understand that gravity is able to cause that thing to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's also the principle of simplicity, which is that the essential, or the Occam's razor is another one that people say, is that like the easiest or the most reasonable explanation is probably the true explanation.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. The simplest explanation is probably correct.
Is correct.
Occam's razor. Yeah. And so that goes along with our straightforward versus complex second point. A key aspect about abductive reasoning when you're comparing two different possible explanations for a particular phenomena or something that you observed is you should usually prefer the one that is straightforward compared to the one that is complex, because it requires fewer assumptions.
Yep. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. I got one more point here. So I actually think this is what miracles is, though. When we're talking about inductive reasoning, like it's going to follow uniformity. If it doesn't follow uniformity, I think that's a miracle, right? Which is something that God can certainly do, like parting the Red Sea. That's not the normal case of gravity and water, right? But God can, since He controls everything, He doesn't have to play by the rules of uniformity. And when He changes uniformity, I think that is quite literally the definition of a miracle. And that's why when that happens throughout, even though infrequently, if it does happen throughout history, that shouldn't be a big shock to us as Christians to believe that uniformity can be broken from a philosophical standpoint. And the philosopher certainly shouldn't have any problem with that, because it's an assumption that we hold, right? And if that assumption can be broken, it's like, that's what C.S. Lewis writes about miracles. It's like,
it's right. It goes to the purpose of natural law, right? It's the idea that, well, you know, we look for natural law because we expect a natural law giver. If there is a natural law giver, then why couldn't He give a new law?
Or even just break it for a moment. You know?
Exactly. Yep.
But yeah, so that's the main point there. Do you want to hit these?
Yeah, sure. So again, exhaustive versus incomplete. A superior explanation, a better explanation for a particular case is going to explain more things than something that is incomplete, something that doesn't explain everything. And then again, logical versus illogical, it'll be consistent, whereas something that's illogical may be contradictory or inconsistent. And then superior versus weak. That idea is along the same lines as the exhaustive, but more of it'll just make more sense. There will be certain intangibles that you maybe can't express, but you just know that it just makes more sense.
How do you factor in for biases with the people who are making these decisions?
Once again, as far as abductive reasoning is concerned, because it's built on deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, you can see how, there's an aspect where, there is a weighing of different explanations and evidence. But when you investigate your reasons for believing them, things come to a bit more light, for sure. So I have another thing about that. But. So
I do too, actually. I think the best way, and this is totally my opinion, is to study the logical fallacies that are most likely to take place when you're talking about logic. Because like we're saying, as long as you hold the core assumptions of uniformity, and as Christians, we should be 100% certain in that. And deduction we can actually prove is true. As long as you hold on to those assumptions, if you practice good reasoning, you will be right. You know what I mean? And that's why science works so good today.
And as far as bias goes, once again, if you generally investigate the reasons behind a particular line of thought, and kind of evaluate them on these scales, stuff will come to more light. So, for example, oftentimes things that are biased require a more complicated explanation of the facts or of the details than a more straightforward, unbiased reason.
That kind of goes back to the simplicity thing too. So.
I mean, you have to have an open mind though to do that. Because if you're going into it biased with what you want to be true, what you what your life has shown you to be true, and it's going to taint how you look at all that information.
Totally. And I mean, there is an aspect of bias which is actually good. For example, the bias, between good and evil, bias between true and false.
Yeah, that's true.
So there are aspects where it's complicated, but putting aside that, like, as far as goals, just you looking into the background behind things will often illuminate it a lot.
But yeah, I 100% agree with you. 'Cause I have a lot of discussions with people about theology just because I find it interesting. And there's a certain, I think most people I won't talk about theology with. I will move the conversation somewhere else because they have such emotional ties to their ideas. For me, it's like I'm trying to find truth, and if you can prove that my thought is wrong, I will happily come to you because that's a good thing, you know. But most people want to be right, and it's just it's unfortunate. But.
Yeah, exactly. So this gets to another one of our tools, which is behind weighing evidence, understanding the different kinds of evidence and how they're evaluated, and then also how we can use them to fit together and to understand the larger puzzle. So yeah, there are many different kinds of evidence, and they all have different standards of what you might call reasonable proof or reasonable evidence. So yeah, we have archaeological evidence, different manuscripts, different testimony, and societal evidence. I'll go over these individually. So archaeological evidence is literally when you find some artifact in the physical world. Ancient Greece, if you've ever been to Greece, you'll see, throughout Athens, all sorts of different massive buildings, which can be considered archaeological evidence because they were built a long time ago, and we have not only historical documentation talking about that, but you can tell from the way it's built and what you infer about society at the time and what you knew about society at the time. So, and in particular, archaeological evidence can be used to confirm or deny testimonial evidence. So it relates very clearly to testimonial evidence, particularly in the Gospels. So an example of this is the Pool of Bethesda, referenced in John chapter 5, verses 2 through 9, as having 5 colonnades. So for a long time, skeptics thought that this description was inaccurate or just wrong or very, very unlikely. But then, recently, they found the actual Pool of Bethesda, and guess what? It has 5 colonnades. And so this is one of those aspects where you can see how archaeological evidence and testimonial evidence fit together. And so sometimes, of course, archaeological evidence contains testimonial evidence in and of itself. And so this is, like, for example, the recently discovered Megiddo mosaic, which is a mosaic that was inscribed, I guess it probably would have been on the floor of a particular temple or something like that. And so it was from a family that had a dedication, and it contains the inscription, God, Jesus Christ, testifying to the early Christian belief that Jesus was actually God in the flesh. And this is the earliest non-scriptural, it's the earliest archaeological reference that we have to the divinity of Jesus. So that dates to the mid-3rd century or 230 AD. And there's obviously lots more that goes into it, but that's just an example of how archaeological evidence can help us fit puzzle pieces together. Manuscripts are often documents that have been prepared and preserved throughout time, and they often contain testimony. But in addition, their construction, the location of where they're found, and more can additionally help us validate that testimony. So for example, Papyrus 46 is a manuscript that contains a copy of most of Romans, and it dates to around 175 to 225 AD. And in addition, it likely came from northern Egypt. And so these facts of knowing its time and location, and particularly its proximal time to when the actual events of, like the Gospels, for example, occurred, in addition to its location in northern Egypt being relatively close to Jerusalem, lends credence to the idea that it contains a valid copy of what the original Romans looked like. And then, of course, testimony is, as far as the New Testament is concerned, is the largest aspect that we tend to look at. So for historical or cold cases, testimonial evidence comes in many forms, right? Manuscripts, it can be on archaeology, even expert witness testimony. So for example, if you read a book about someone, or you read a book from someone investigating these sort of things, you're kind of accepting their own testimony and their own reasoning as a sort of expert witness would. And so, as an example, the gospel accounts aren't just pieces of paper, but they claim to be witness testimony about the events of the time. And yeah, books on this topic like Cold Case Christianity, or the other one I referenced, Testimonies to the Truth by Lydia McGrew, is once again, you could kind of consider those to be expert witness testimony. And so, of course, this testimony can be inspected, cross-examined, and tested to see if it actually holds up, if it's consistent, if it's accurate, if it's honest, if it's complete. And then societal evidence is actually another kind. So often how society reacts to a particular event can tell us about the event itself. So for example, the American War on Terror can tell us about how the American people and political powers of the time reacted to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. If someone claimed that the 9/11 terrorist attack was a hoax, that it was fake, then they would need to provide some other reasonable explanation for the societal response to those.
Which is like, that makes so much sense when you say it to 9/11 and then you apply it to the resurrection of Christ and everyone loses.
Yeah, exactly. So then you apply that same line of reasoning to Christianity. In the same way, the rapid rise of Christianity within the Roman Empire, despite extreme persecution, is evidence that people were influenced by something sudden, convincing, and powerful. So any proposed explanation for the rapid rise of Christianity needs to account for those effects that we observe in order to be considered reasonable.
I think that alone is probably the strongest piece of evidence for Christ's resurrection.
There's a lot of very strong pieces that we'll get through in this series. But that is a really key point, I think.
Personally, for me,
is you can just look at the way that society has been pointed. I mean, pretty much all of Western thought and civilization ends up being built on that to some degree, and morals and whatever else. So, and then of course to go along with this, we have two extra things that that can help inform us and help us come to conclusions about particular pieces of evidence. So, for example, evidence that has the ability to speak for itself is usually more powerful, usually has greater capability of giving us understanding than something else. So, for example, something that's self-aware can be a lot more powerful and explanatory because it can imply purpose and intent to us, or even just say it clearly. So, a really clear example of this is in the Gospel of John, where he says in chapter 20, verses 30 through 31, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So it very clearly states the intent and purpose of why John was writing this book. And then we can observe and see, well, does he have a bias? Does his bias align with what he's writing? Does it hold up, what he's writing as true, or does it tear it down? So many people will say, well, hey, this, many people take that claim, right, and say, hey, he's biased, he should be dismissed as biased. But once again, we should be biased towards the truth. And it's only a problem if, once again, it leads us away from the truth.
Also, I think that's probably a logical fallacy there to even question it, because even abductive of reasoning, you have to posit a claim first. In all these types of reasoning, you can't just look at raw evidence and pull anything from it. That's just a thing, right? You have to posit something and then test the evidence against it. So for him to make a claim like Christ is Lord and then to provide evidence is just inductive reasoning, right? So, and you can't even apply deductive reasoning to that.
Exactly. So people will say, well, because he wrote this, then he made up things to hold up but it doesn't make sense, because once again, he's saying, believe me if what I'm saying is true. So knowing why something is or isn't here also can go a long way to explaining if and why it can be trusted. So as another example, we know that tombs are used to store dead people, right? If we see a tomb that has an inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, it's probably safe to assume that Jesus of Nazareth was stored there, or at least was supposed to be stored there. And even greater than that, was a real person. People don't make tombs and inscribe them with the names of fake people. Right?
Yeah.
And so just simply by knowing the nature of why tombs exist, we can reasonably infer other details about history.
Yeah, it all makes sense when you say it, but then when you can see, when you leave these key points out when you're talking about something like the good of Christ, you can miss a main point. You know?
Exactly. And so then additionally, evidence that can be compared with others is the best. We don't want stuff just all on their own isolated. We want to be able to figure out how they're entangled together, how they connect, so that we can build this bigger picture, because the reality of asking the question, is the New Testament historically reliable, is a really big question, and there's lots of different aspects that go into it. But in order to see that big picture of yes or no, we need to be able to interconnect a lot of things. And then finally, being consistent is super, super important. Oftentimes you will see, particularly among skeptics, and sometimes among non-skeptics, how they will be inconsistent in their comparison of different kinds of evidence, or evidence testifying to different kinds of things.
Yeah, that's the bias we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, evidence for the existence even of Julius Caesar, which is taken as universally true, no one ever questions that, isn't really even stronger than the evidence for Jesus. But people do question whether Jesus existed.
Right.
And so, once again, it's just part of the reality of things having happened in the past, and we're dealing with incomplete manuscripts, we're dealing with things that have deteriorated over time. And so once again, when we're evaluating these things, it's really important to understand what is a reasonable belief based on the evidence, and then what is an unreasonable belief, and if we're being consistent about these. If I believe some historical thing as being true, but then I go over here and I say, no, that couldn't possibly have happened, and you look at them and the evidence for one is higher than the other, maybe you should, maybe that's illuminating your bias.
Right. Good.
So how do people respond to that? How do the people who believe in Julius Caesar but don't believe in Jesus, when they're confronted with that, how do they respond?
So oftentimes, often particular skeptics, their claim as it pertains to this will be the Bible contains miracles, so it can't be trusted.
Yeah.
Whereas they'll say, Julius Caesar doesn't require me to believe in a miracle, right? So they'll shift the goalposts, right? So instead of looking at the evidence itself, they'll make a claim outside of the evidence and impose that upon the evidence.
So yeah, I think that's true. I would say that's true certainly for the less fair or educated even skeptic. But like people like Dawkins, like the ones that are real smart, I mean you can't say those people aren't smart, they would say it's crazy to say that Jesus doesn't exist, because they'll just accept that claim. They'll be like, yeah, if you want to say Plato exists, you have to say Jesus existed.
Sure. But like over implications of things and whatever else, there's a lot of debate for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, again, I think that specifically that point is among serious atheists is not debated as hotly as I think we sometimes.
Yes, it's true. Most skeptics don't really consider being consistent. They're just like, well, no, I didn't want to think about consistency across all of history. I just wanted to think about this one thing.
Yeah.
And so then they'll either come to a position of agnosticism, or they'll come to a conclusion of, based on their presuppositions. Generally, is what I see is they come up with an idea of, well, miracles can't exist, so there.
Yeah. Well, as I'm reading a book by Rishi Sproul right now, and as he says, it's like nobody actually has like historicity problems with the gospel. I mean, it's always something deeper. They don't want to. They hate God, something like that.
Yep. Very often that is the case, but that's usually among what you would consider like an expert scholar. Regular people often, if they have a bias, they may not know how strongly they hold to it. And so illuminating it can only help.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue into the next part here. So witness testimony. We talked about this pretty good, so I'm going to actually go through it quickly. But I think there's 2 points on witness testimony. First, I think when I first started looking into this, and everyone, like, I can't remember who I was reading. Oh, Dr. William Craig, that's who it was. He was saying that witness testimony is a huge deal and it's super accurate. And I was like, is that really true? I feel like people lie.
People lie all the time.
Right? But in all honesty, that's actually like the main source of evidence we use in like all court cases.
Yeah,
is witness
pretty much,
testimony.
pretty
Yeah.
much.
So,
there are plenty of cases where they're entirely circumstantial.
Mm-hmm.
As in, we don't have any eyewitnesses. We,
Mm-hmm.
you know, might not even have like a murder weapon or whatever. But you know, we found DNA at the crime scene. We found hair follicles, all that sort of stuff.
Even that's pretty relatively new. I mean, since DNA sequencing. So,
Yeah.
But witness testimony is essentially everything. Another thing that I found interesting about this is, like, one of my favorite philosophers is Søren Kierkegaard. He was I think Danish or Swedish, I think Swedish philosopher. That he's the father of existentialism. So he's all about being your own person, and very strong Christian, really brilliant man. But he would say that that we actually outsource pretty much everything that we are as individuals. Like, if you hear something from like a teacher, an authority, you're just going to accept that as true, and that's essentially like, you know, testimony. So most of what we know, we just take on faith because someone said it. And he would say, as the father of existentialism, that's a horrible thing. You need to make sure that you become your own individual and cross-examine these things. But that, which is true. But also, it's like we also have to just recognize this is like 90% of the time is right.
Yeah.
You know. I don't think we have time to go into logical fallacies. So, if you have anything to close up on.
Yeah, sure. One of the key aspects behind witness testimony, and particularly for court cases, what the judge will instruct juries upon, at least in California, is to trust a witness, you know, unless you have a specific reason provided in the courtroom for why to not trust them.
Yeah.
And it's very, very important because, again, we should accept or expect that people in their purpose and intent, if we can see that purpose and intent aligning with us, then and aligning with a direction that we see as true, then maybe we don't have a reason to say, oh, they're just lying about stuff. Oh, they're lying about miracles. They're lying about having seen that, or they were mistaken about, you know, something along those lines. But instead, only when we find in cross-examination that they lied about something or that they said something untrue, then that is a reason to bring their other testimony into doubt.
Yeah.
So.
All right, good stuff.
Yeah. Yep. Next week we're doing philosophical background. So we'll talk a little bit more about miracles, really specifically miracles. Are they possible? What are reasons for believing miracles, reasons for not believing miracles? And then particularly as it pertains to this historical investigation.
Yeah.
Is it something that we have to come to a conclusion on, or is it something that we can set aside?
Yeah. Hopefully we can make it a little more, especially that, a little more practical too, and bring in some real pieces of evidence.
Yep.
Too. So,
yeah.
Awesome. So, yeah. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you for coming.
Mm-hmm.